Former French military agent Pierre-Henri Bernal also claims that Al-Qaeda was the name for a database. While he was working to translate faxes and letters for French intelligence, he claims Al-Qaeda was part of a database used by the United Nations group called Islamic Conference, which represents 57 countries, including those in the Middle East. Because this database linked countries like Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia, the Mujahideen and the Taliban could use the email in the system to send each other messages. But if the term Al-Qaeda simply grew out of a database system used by some of the Operation Cyclone Islamists, then how organised and powerful is the group? And why are many terrorist acts today claimed to be from a group called Al-Qaeda?
In looking for an organisation, the Americans and the British were chasing a phantom enemy and missing the real threat.
I was with the Royal Marines as they trooped around eastern Afghanistan, and every time they got a location for a supposed Al-Qaeda or Taliban element or base, they'd turn up and there was no one there, or there'd be a few startled shepherds. And that struck me then as being a wonderful image for the war on terror, because people are looking for something that isn't there. There is no organisation with its terrorist operatives, cells, sleeper cells, so on and so forth. What there is an idea prevalent among young, angry Muslim males throughout the Islamic world. That idea is what poses a threat.
For beyond his own small group, bin Laden had no formal organisation until the Americans invented one for him.
The idea, which is critical to the FBI's prosecution, that bin Laden ran a coherent organisation with operatives and cells all around the world, of which you could be a member, is a myth. There is no Al-Qaeda organisation. There is no international network with a leader, with cadres who will unquestioningly obey orders, with tentacles that stretch out to sleeper cells in America, in Africa, in Europe. That idea of a coherent, structured terrorist network with an organised capability simply does not exist.
Pierre-Henri Bernal corroborates this notion. He says, the truth is, there is no Islamic army or terrorist group called Al-Qaeda, and any informed intelligence officer knows this. But there is a propaganda campaign to make the public believe in the presence of an identified entity representing the devil, only in order to drive the TV watcher to accept a unified international leadership for a war against terrorism. The country behind this propaganda is the US, and the lobbyists for the US war on terrorism are only interested in making money. In the hysteria surrounding 9/11, it appears the neocon government oversimplified the threat of terrorism and used the boogeyman idea of bin Laden and Al-Qaeda to rally up support for an invasion of Afghanistan.
You have to look at who has the organization and who has the capability to do something like this, and of course bin Laden's Al-Qaeda organization has to be right at the top of the list.
There is little evidence that bin Laden openly used the term Al-Qaeda in reference to an organised group until an interview after the attacks, when the mainstream news media were filtered the information and talking points by the CIA and other official sources.
You know, senior U.S. intelligence officials, or one senior U.S. intelligence official, says now that the U.S. is 90% certain that bin Laden was responsible for today's attack.
It was the closest term they had that could simplify who they thought was responsible without going into the intricacies of America's own involvement in Afghanistan.
Our current president now inherited a legacy from his father and inherited a political legacy that's responsible for training militarily, economically, and situating geopolitically the parties involved in the alleged assassination and murder of my father and countless of thousands of others.
As we've established throughout this documentary, the CIA worked with bin Laden in the 80s to foment radical fundamentalist Islam. It is this radical fundamentalist Islam that poses a threat. Militant Islamists could come to bin Laden's front charity to obtain funding, arms and training, but they then went off to pursue their own missions rather than being instructed by bin Laden himself. There is no evidence that even links bin Laden directly to the 9/11 attacks.
So we've never made the case or argued the case that somehow Osama bin Laden was directly involved in 9/11. That evidence has never been forthcoming.
And he is not wanted by the FBI for the attacks. The authenticity of his confession tape is far from concrete. Shortly after 9/11, the Pentagon claimed to be in possession of a videotape that showed bin Laden confessing to the attacks. It was heralded as proof that an organised Al-Qaeda were responsible, but skeptics soon began to ask questions about its authenticity. The tape was remarkably found out of the blue in a house in Jalalabad, Afghanistan, and handed to the Pentagon by an unnamed source. While British Foreign Secretary Jack Straw and the Bush administration vouched for its credibility, others said it was of too poor quality and could have easily been fake. PhD Islamologist and Arabist Kevin Barrett, who has translated bin Laden tapes professionally, calls this tape the Fatty bin Laden tape, claiming his body weight and facial features are different from the real bin Ladens at the time. Barrett also claims the audio is only a passable imitation of bin Laden's voice. One explanation for bin Laden's appearance, at least, given by video expert Andrew Laws, is that the video image may have been squished from its original 4:3 ratio to add in the subtitles.
It's during that process that this distortion's occurred.
The smoking gun, however, comes from the US translation and not the footage itself. A scholar of Islamic and Arabic studies at the University of Hamburg did an independent translation. In German and European press, he said, "This tape is of such poor quality that many passages are unintelligible, and those that are intelligible have often been taken out of context so that you can't use that as evidence." The American translators who listened to the tape and transcribed it obviously added things they wanted to hear in many places. The Pentagon translation quotes the bin Laden character as saying, "We calculated in advance the number of casualties from the enemy," which implies prior to the attack they summed up how many people would die inside the towers. However, in the German translation, this quote becomes, "We calculated the number of casualties from the enemy," without the important words "in advance," which implies bin Laden and his associates were simply watching the news report and assessing the number of deaths like everybody else. The sentence, "We had notification since the previous Thursday that the event would take place that day," became, "We had received a message on Thursday." This could have been any message on any Thursday. And the quote, "We asked each of them to go to America," is said to be another mistranslation that should have said, "They were required to go to America," rather than being sent. The German translation removes any reference to bin Laden's involvement. This begs the question, who got it wrong? We might not know without a reinvestigation into all of this evidence. If it makes any difference, CIA officials have since come out and admitted to faking bin Laden tapes. As reported in the Washington Post, one video showed bin Laden and his cronies sitting around a campfire, swigging bottles of liquor and savouring their conquests with boys.